Welcome back, everyone, and today we're going to keep going with sexual selection. We're on Module 3. We're going to talk about what evolution has to say about how many individuals you should mate with and why evolution has anything to say about that at all. So let's start with a knowledge check. Go ahead and answer this question on the side of your screen. So that review of the elements that are important for natural selection are going to be important for you to keep in your head as we go through the unit today. So here's a quick reminder of where we've been and where we're going. So we talked about why sex exists as a form of reproduction. We talked about why there are different sexes within a species. And today we're going to talk about how many individuals one should mate with and why that matters, which is going to help us think about sexual selection. And so for next time, we can get into forms of sexual selection. And we're not doing this. I forgot to delete it. So specifically today, we're going to hit on the strength of sexual selection and how it's related to variation in mating success. We're going to talk about how gamete investment and parental investment impact mating success and its relationship to reproductive success. And then we're going to talk about how all of this leads to a couple outcomes of sexual selection. So I want to start here with one of my favorite quotes from Charles Darwin. He says, "The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail whenever I gaze at it makes me sick." He's saying this because the peacock's tail, having that long train that really doesn't do anything but is heavy and maybe is something a predator could grab onto, right, is something that runs kind of counter to his ideas of natural selection. And at the time, he didn't really have a good explanation for that, and he really struggled with the peacock's tail and what it said about evolution by natural selection. He did eventually come up with the idea of sexual selection, which he wrote about in his second book, which is much less famous than his first, The Descent of Man and Sex Selection in Relation to Sex. And that's where he really introduced the idea of sexual selection. And most researchers now consider sexual selection sort of a special case of natural selection that's focused on mating success rather than sort of survival, but it's all still related to fitness, so they're related to each other. So here again is the definition of sexual selection that we talked about in the last module. So sexual selection is competition for mates among individuals of the same sex, so individuals with the same gamete types, right, that lead to differential reproductive success due to differences in their abilities to obtain mates. So it's competitions between individuals of the same sex to get mates. And so we can ask the question, what sexes actually experience the strongest sexual selection? And to answer that question, we need a couple different types of data. First, we need to know the variation in mating success. For each sex. So essentially, i.e., how many mates is each sex mating with? Okay. The next piece of information we need is the variation in lifetime reproductive success. Okay, and this for each sex, sorry. So this we would measure as the number of offspring each individual is leaving behind. So we're measuring the number of matings individuals are getting and the number of offspring they're leaving behind. And finally, we want to understand the nature of the relationship between these two variables. So between mating success and reproductive success. Okay. These three pieces of data are necessary to understand which sex is experiencing the strongest sexual selection. So why? Why is it those pieces of information? So given what you know about how selection works, right, so the postulates, right, that we just reviewed, why are these three pieces of information important to know? All right, so I want you to briefly explain why each one is important and kind of make parallels back to those postulates. All right, so nice work brainstorming those, and now let's kind of go through why we need to know each of these pieces. So piece one was variation in mating success. So why do we need to know this? Well, this relates to one of the postulates, right? If there is no variation in mating success, then there's nothing for selection to act on. Right? Variation is the raw material of evolution. If there's no variation, there's no evolution. And then, if one sex has more variation than another, then there's more potential for selection to occur in that sex. More potential for selection to occur in that sex. Right? So variation is the raw material. The more variation you have, the more there is for selection to select among, this time sexual selection, but it's the same idea. And so it's also differences in the strength of selection because of differences in relative fitness, right? So if you've got big differences between how many mates individuals get, some get 0, some get 100, then your fitness consequences are larger and your selection coefficients are larger, right? So 2 reasons why variation is important. So how about variation in lifetime reproductive success? So variation in the number of offspring. We talked about that with natural selection, right? And it's the very same logic as above. Right? So if there's no variation in number of offspring, then there's no differences in fitness and there's nothing for selection to act on. But if one sex has more variation than the other, then that sex is the one that's going to have selection acting on it the strongest. All right? So now the third piece of information. This was the harder one. So the nature of the relationship between mating success and reproductive success. Well, think of mating success as almost the trait, right? As the phenotype. And if mating success is unrelated to fitness, right? If it's unrelated to the offspring you leave behind, then selection isn't going to happen on that trait because it's not related to fitness. So if mating success is unrelated to reproductive success, then there is no fitness consequence of number of mates. If there's no fitness consequence, then really we're talking about genetic drift being what drives kind of number of mates, right? Not selection. You have to have fitness consequences for selection to cause the evolution of a trait, right? All right. So that was sort of our review, kind of pulling in our understanding of natural selection and how it relates to sexual selection. The principles are really the same. We just are thinking about mating success rather than overall fitness. So based on what we just said, we can conclude that the sex experiencing the greater variation in reproductive success will experience the strongest sexual selection. And what do I mean by variation in reproductive success? It can kind of mostly look two different ways. Variation in reproductive success can look like one, many individuals of one sex don't produce offspring. So if only a few individuals produce offspring and most of them don't, you're creating big differences in fitness, right? But it can also look like, many individuals of one sex get to produce offspring, but they only produce a few. And, or while a few individuals produce a lot of offspring. All right, so that's two different ways you could see variation. It could be that everyone gets to mate, but some only have a few offspring and others have a lot of offspring. Or it could be that not everybody gets to mate and only a few do and get to produce offspring. And one of the big points I want to make in this lecture is that which sex experiences the strongest sexual selection and therefore is predicted to compete for mates. Varies from species to species. Just because you know the sex doesn't mean you know the whole story. Okay? So in some species, so for example in our peacock again, that Darwin hated so much, males have more variation in reproductive success. And we can see that by these bars. These bars are probably the standard deviation. And the bigger the bars, the more variation. More differences between individuals. So the bars are bigger for males than for females, which means there's more variation in reproductive success for males than for females. With the blue-footed boobies here, we actually see equal variation in reproductive success. So the strength of sexual selection is the same in both of these species, and it's pretty small for both of them. And then in these phalaropes, we see the opposite pattern, where females have more variation in reproductive success, and so they have the stronger sexual selection. So again, the point is, you have to know these three pieces of data that we collected to really know what's going on in the system. You can't assume just based on the sex of an individual. Okay, so the top part we've already said and you've already written down. So we're here. What factors influence variation in, and this should be reproductive success. So, and the relationship between reproductive success and mating success. So here are the things that can influence reproductive success, and so are important for sexual selection. The number of mates that an individual can mates with, and an individual's investment in offspring. And this investment can be investment in gametes, right? We've talked about provisioning of gametes. But it can also be after the offspring are born, and that's considered parental care. So investment in offspring and number of mates impact each other and the relationship between the variables and mating success. So we're going to see a couple examples of this next. So let's focus first on the role of gamete investment and number of mates. So if you invest more or less in gametes, how does that impact how many individuals you should mate with to optimize your reproductive success? All right. So we're going to talk about a hermaphroditic snail, so a snail that produces both eggs and sperm. And this was a research study where they established 24 groups of snails that had never mated before. And these snails each produce large and small gametes. And the researchers watched copulations and recorded who contributed small versus large gametes. All right, so if you contributed gametes, that was a successful mating. And then they collected the eggs from the matings and noted which individuals survived at least 2 weeks after hatching. So which of the eggs were actually viable. And they used a genetic test to determine who contributed to those viable offspring. So that was their measure of reproductive success. So they counted matings and they counted offspring. All right, and then they wanted to relate matings to offspring to see what predicted reproductive success. So in a second, you're going to get graphs of the outcomes from this, but I want to orient you first to kind of the axes so you know what you're looking at. So on the left are matings that were done with small gametes. So this is focused on the success of small gametes. So if you contributed sperm, what was your mating success like? And then how did that relate to your reproductive success? Okay. On the right is mating success of when contributing large gametes or contributing eggs. And how does that relate to your reproductive success? So what you're going to see is individuals who had 0, 1, 2, or 3 matings, and we're going to look at how the number of matings relates to reproductive success. And there are going to be 2 lines that come up. The first line, the solid line here, is going to include 0. So if you had 0 matings, obviously you have no reproductive success, right? So that's kind of a known and a given for everybody. So they also looked at what happens when you take the zeros, the individuals who didn't get to mate, out completely, and that's going to be the dotted line. All right, so a series of questions are going to pop up to kind of walk you through these graphs, and we're going to think about what is the relationship between how much you invest in gametes and how mates relate to reproductive success. All right, so here is the data. Okay, so let's go through this now. So if we look first at small gametes, what do we see? We see this horizontal line, both when we include the 0, or diagonal line, both when we include the 0 and when we don't. And I hope that this kind of connected with you, connected to thinking about selection gradients, right? So when we have a line that isn't flat, selection is occurring. There's a relationship between the trait and fitness, right? So reproductive success is our measure of fitness, and the trait was how many matings you have. So for males, there's a positive relationship between the number of matings you have and your reproductive success. So how many offspring you make. When we come over and we look at large gametes, so individuals that are producing large gametes, when you look at the line including 0, there does seem to be a relationship, but if you take 0 out, there's no longer a relationship. There's no relationship, right? We can see it here because it's a horizontal line between the number of mates and your reproductive success. Okay. Now, for individuals producing small gametes, there was a relationship, right? There was a positive relationship between number, mates, and reproductive success. Okay. So when you produce large gametes, it doesn't seem like mates and the number of mates that you have is what influences how many offspring you have. But when you produce small gametes, the number of mates you have influences how many offspring you have. So we can think about this and you thought about what trade-offs seem to be important for this, and the trade-off was the size number. Trade-off explains this. Okay, so if you're producing only a few large gametes, then whoever you mate with, one mating because they have lots of small gametes is enough to fertilize all your offspring. You don't need multiple matings. But if you produce a lot of gametes, you're not gamete limited at all, then you can mate multiple times and keep acquiring more and more offspring. So let's summarize these findings sort of in general, all right? Let's put it together. So due to the relative costs differences of producing eggs versus sperm, individuals producing eggs have fewer gametes, right? Because eggs are our large gametes. Thus, individuals producing eggs are gamete limited in terms of reproductive success, and individuals producing sperm are mate limited. So this means the more mates, to just put this a different way, the more mates an individual with small gametes has, the greater their fitness. This pattern is not true for individuals making large gametes. They may just need one mate. To maximize their fitness. And again, this is because they produce so few gametes. And their partner produces so many. Okay? So that is how gamete investment influences number of mates and the relationship of number of mates to reproductive success. But we can talk about another type of investment. We can talk about parental investment. And parental investment, again, is investment in offspring after they are born. So after they kind of leave the mother's body, okay? So large gametes are produced by one sex, right? That's by our definition from the last unit. But any sex can invest in the offspring after they are born, essentially. So it's not really tied to one sex or the other. So the example we're going to talk about is pipefish. In pipefish, males have a brood pouch, which you can see a close-up of here, into which females lay their eggs. The males then carry those eggs, protect them, and provide them with oxygen until they hatch. And that takes about 4 to 6 weeks that males are providing parental care to the eggs. Females, once they've released a set of eggs to males, then make more eggs throughout the breeding season, okay, and can leave them with other males. So down here, you're seeing in these graphs the variation in number of mates, the variation in number of offspring, and the relationship of number of mates to number of offspring for males and for female pipefish. So again, a set of questions is going to pop up to kind of walk you through these graphs and help us think about how parental investment impacts the relationship of number of mates and number of offspring. Okay, so there's a few things that I hope you noticed in the graphs. First of all, if we look at number of offspring, we see that females are way more likely not to get to mate at all than males. Very few males are at 0, right? Whereas almost 25 females are. Sorry, number of offspring. The same thing is happening with number of mates. Almost 25 females have no mates, but only 6 males do. So it seems like there's more variation in female reproductive success than in male reproductive success, right? So in terms of getting mates, males are likely to get at least one, but females are not necessarily. And so it's a little bit of a different pattern than you might expect. And then if we come over and look at the relationship between number of offspring and number of mates, it's a little bit hard to see by just comparing the two graphs, but let me overlay the two lines for you. So I'm just going to take the line for females and add it to the chart with the male line. When I do that, you can now see that the selection gradient for females is steeper than the selection gradient for males, which means females are experiencing stronger selection. So the number of mates is more closely related to the number of offspring for females than it is for males. So when we're talking about parental investment, here's what we can conclude. When one parent invests more than the other in each offspring, the reproductive success of the heavily invested parents is often limited by resources and time. Right? If they're taking care of one set of young, they can't take care of another set, for example. So, but in contrast, the reproductive success of the lightly invested parent is limited by number of mates. So because the female seahorse, she may invest more in her gametes, right? Because she's producing eggs. But she's not investing in parental care. The male is. And so in this case, the parental care cost and the investment there is greater than what was invested in the gametes. And so in this case, the male is the one limited by resources and time invested in the offspring, and the female is limited by mates. So again, the point is you can't just tell from the sex who's going to benefit more from multiple matings. You have to go in and look at the system. Who's investing more in the offspring? Okay, so let's summarize what we just went through and just make some general rules for ourselves. So 1, the sex that invests the most in offspring and this can be in the form of large gametes or intensive parental care, is limited by the number of gametes they can produce or the number of offspring they can successfully raise. They do not need to mate with a large number of individuals to maximize their reproductive success. They're resource limited, not mate limited, right? They only have so many resources to invest in their offspring. All right, 2. The sex that invests the least in offspring, so small gametes, or little parental care, is limited by the number of mates they can produce offspring with. Okay, so the more they mate, the more mates they have, the higher their fitness. And here's where this really gets interesting, right? The sex ratio, so the ratio of males to females in most species is 1-to-1, so 50%. So individuals if individuals of a sex are mating with multiple mates. Others aren't of that sex, aren't getting to mate at all. Aren't getting to mate at all, right? So that's setting up that variation in fitness. So a trait that increases the number of mates an individual with low parental investment, or low offspring investment, which is gametes and parental care. So a trait that increases the number of mates an individual with low offspring investment gets, so can acquire, is favored by sexual selection and will spread through the population. On the other hand, a trait that increases the number of mates that an individual with the high offspring investment can acquire isn't favored. There isn't as much of a relationship there, and so that trait would not spread. So again, sexual selection is only acting on the sex that has the highest variation in reproductive success. And the other important point here, just to remind you, is that which sex experiences the strongest sexual selection and acquire these traits varies from species to species. So you need to do the study. You need to look at how many mates is each individual getting and how many offspring is each individual getting and what is the relationship between number of mates and number of offspring. Oh, and I also should add, there's other reasons to mate multiply that we're not talking about here, right? We're talking about what evolution is focused on, and especially sexual selection. But you could think about compatibility or inbreeding avoidance or other things like that that also would cause the individual that's doing more investment in their offspring to mate multiply. But this is the general idea behind sexual selection. And those are special cases that we're not really going to get into, but they exist, and I just want to acknowledge that. Okay, so given what we just talked about and what you know about the biology of our own species, which of the three outcomes below do you predict best represents sexual selection in humans? And I want you to make an argument, so you're going to write this out, not just choose one, for your conclusion using evidence that you have of human biology. All right, so take a minute or so to build your argument. Okay, so let me show you some data from humans. There's actually not a lot of data, so it's hard to answer this question. Also, humans are complicated, so it's hard to answer this question. But here's one researcher sort of attempted this. So let me explain these variables. Var-M is variation in reproductive success for males, so for individuals producing sperm. Var-F is the variation in reproductive success for females, so individuals producing eggs. And by definition of this study. And then what we're going to look at, and what's really important, is that ratio of the variation in reproductive success between males and females. So remember from early on, I said if that variation is the same, then the strength of selection is the same on both. If the variation is higher for males, then males would be predicted to mate multiply, and if it's higher for females, then females would be predicted. And when we look at humans, we have to take into account different cultures and different mating systems, but the majority of cases, the VM to VF ratio is approximately 1, which means the strength of sexual selection is the same on both males and females. There are some societies where VM to VF is greater than 1, in which case we would predict males would mate more than females. But if we look, for example, at the US, here, we're right in there at right around 1. So the strength of sexual selection acting on males and females is the same. Okay, so that's, again, there's a lot of variables that go into this. This is just one measure, but if we're thinking about it in the same terms we were thinking about pipefish and snails, it seems like all of our, males and females are under sexual selection, and they're experiencing about the same strength of it. So to kind of start moving us into what we're going to talk about next week, let's think about what it means to have stronger sexual selection in one sex than the other. And again, I meant to have you write this out, but I didn't animate it, so you can just read it. Members of the sex that have the stronger sexual selection are predicted to compete for mates. And this can be directly competing, which can be things like combat or trying to hold territory, things like that. Or it can be indirect competition, which is competition by trying to be more attractive than other individuals of your same sex. Okay? And then members of the sex that have weaker sexual selection, because they're investing so much in their offspring, they're actually predicted to be choosy, to want to try to find the right mate for their offspring that's going to maximize, right, the possibility that each of those offspring that they're investing so much in are going to be successful. And again, who plays what role depends on the particular conditions of the mating system or society. There are no universals in sexual selection. All right, so that finishes our little piece on thinking about what evolution has to say about how many individuals you should mate with to get the highest fitness. Next time, we're going to dive a little bit more into what sexual selection is and isn't, and then really get into the forms that sexual selection can take. Talk to you all soon. Join me for office hours on Thursday if you want, or on Monday. Bye.